Hello, Facebook. Uh, Welcome to another Deleted Scenes. As you'll notice, we're using the computer screen again because this week we're going to be looking at Matthew 24, and we're going to be looking kind of in detail. So I wanted to be able to show you exactly the verses that we're talking about. The question that we're dealing with today was posed as part of our sermon yesterday. I was preaching on the last set of parables in the Gospel of Matthew, and those are in chapter 25, but they're set up by the conversation that Jesus has in chapter 24. And unfortunately, chapter 24 is one of those chapters that you can't really just brisk over. You have to get into it more if you really want to see what's happening and decide what you believe is happening. It takes a closer look because there are several different perspectives on what's going on here. And if you're like me, you may have been taught one perspective and only ever been able to see that perspective when you read it. So what I want to do today is I want to show you the two different sides of this passage and perhaps whet your appetite for a little bit more in-depth Bible reading and some connections with the Old Testament. And if nothing else, perhaps help you appreciate the fact that people can look at the same passage of Scripture and come up with some very different interpretations. Now, the passage that we're looking at in Matthew 24, if you put the headings on in your Bible, that the destruction of the temple and signs of the end times. The NIV titles it this way, and they're kind of hedging their bets because they're covering both. The way I was taught this passage, it was in a church that was very focused on the end times and a particular view of the end times, and this passage is one that they would use for that a lot. And it's also a passage, one of the common passages that is used to support a doctrine known as the rapture. Now, many of you may just take the doctrine of the rapture for granted and assume that that's just what Christians believe. Truth is that Christians only started believing in the rapture. Any Christians started believing it in the 1800s when that doctrine was developed. And this is one of the passages that's used for that, and it's based on the assumption that Jesus is talking about the end of time. So we're going to look at this. We're going to look at what it has to say, and we're going to see just what's going on here. So it begins with Jesus. He's been in the temple with his disciples, and they're walking away from the temple, and he tells them, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So the beginning of the conversation is on the destruction of the temple. Okay, that's what he says that to them, and it seems like they just move on, and then they leave the city. And when they get to the Mount of Olives, then the disciples ask him discreetly, "When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" This sentence, or this verse here, really sets up for us this question of what he's talking about. When they say, "When will this happen?" they are asking about the temple. When will the temple be destroyed as Jesus said it would? And we know the answer to that question. The second temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD, or 80-70 if you say it. Anyway, it was destroyed about 40 years after this conversation. And so we know that that's when that happened. But then notice that they ask three things. When will that happen, the destruction of the temple? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, first we have to ask, what were they thinking of? Were they thinking that these were three different things, or were they thinking that this was the same thing? And then we can talk about whether we think they're the same thing or different things. So I would say that the disciples, I don't know if they're probably asking here what role, they're not sure whether the temple will be destroyed at the same time that Jesus will come and the end of the age will come. But they definitely thought that those other two things would happen together. Now the question is, I never really asked myself, why would they ask him when he's coming? He's right there in front of them, and they don't know that he's going to die and be resurrected and ascend and then return later. They don't understand that yet. So why are they asking about his coming? Now, what I've done here is I have highlighted the different passages we look at in colors that help us see what they're doing. Blue are verses that clearly point towards the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Red are the ones that tend to point towards the end of the world interpretation, and this orange yellowy color is parts that you might think refer to the end of the world, but may not, depending on how you connect it with the Old Testament. See, when they ask, what will be the sign of your coming? That's an important phrase, and Jesus is going to use it later. He's going to say that, where does he say it? Did I not highlight it? There is a place where he says that this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. He talks several times about the coming of the Son of Man. I'm sorry, there is a different chapter where Jesus says that the generation will not pass away until they see the Son of Man come. That is a particular phrase. It's a quote from the Old Testament. It's actually a quote from Daniel 7. Now, when we talk about the coming of Jesus, the second coming, we use that word because it's in here so much, and we assume that that's talking about Jesus coming to earth from heaven. But when you look at it in this context, before they knew there would be a second coming, you realize that they're actually referring to a section in Daniel 7. Daniel has a vision, and in the vision, he says this: "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man." Son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Okay? That is the hyperlink that is being made to the Old Testament. So here's the question. When the Son of Man comes, where is he coming to? Well, clearly here he's coming to heaven. He approaches the Ancient of Days and is led into his presence. So the coming of the Son of Man is not about him coming down to earth from heaven. In Daniel and in the Old Testament and in the Jewish mindset, it's about him coming before God and being made king. Now, I don't know if we know exactly how the Jews interpreted that. They may have interpreted it a couple of different ways. Coming into his presence might have been symbolic. It might have been something that would happen. They might have thought of that as something that would happen in the temple. I don't know that they thought that the Son of Man would actually ascend into heaven the way Jesus did. But the connection that we end up seeing is with the ascension, that Jesus actually goes to heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father. And that can help us to solve this puzzle where Jesus says that the people of the people in front of him, there are some who will not pass away before they see the Son of Man coming. Well, Jesus comes to heaven, and that did happen within their lifetimes. So this might actually be asking about something other than the second coming. Now, the question about the end of the age, now there's a whole question about when the age ends and when you would say the age ends. Do you say that it ends when it's completely gone, or do you say that it ends when the battle is won? Because you could identify two different time periods. If you say that the end of the age is when the beginning of the end, that would be when Jesus defeats evil, or when it's completely gone, which would be at the end of time. It could be either one. So how does Jesus answer this question about these three things? He says, "Many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of the birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Now let's pause there. Does that point towards the destruction of Jerusalem, or does that point towards the end of the world? It doesn't really, it could apply to either interpretation, but I do want to challenge you with a question. Does it sound like Jesus is talking to the disciples about something that will happen to them? Or does it sound like Jesus is telling them something that they should hold on to and pass on to later generations because they will experience it? Now, the thing that I keep getting caught up on is that, because I'm not entirely decided, I'll tell you that, right? I haven't come down on one side or the other, but it certainly feels like Jesus is warning them about things that will happen to them. And these are things that will happen during the lifetime of the disciples and between when Jesus is speaking and the destruction of Jerusalem. So this could go either way. Then it says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And that may seem to indicate that it's an end times thing because it's being preached to the whole world and to all nations. And that's possible. It could mean that. It also could refer to the ends of the earth or to all the nations the way it does in some other places in the New Testament, which is the known world. So in Acts, when Jesus says he's going to send them out, he tells his disciples he's going to send them out to Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. They go out to the ends of the earth as they know it. And the book of Acts ends with the gospel in Rome and spreading out through the Roman Empire. So that could apply to the whole earth, or it could apply to the whole world as they know it. He continues. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it would be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Okay, is this talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or the end times? Well, the abomination that causes desolation, that's desecrating the temple. And that happened, the Romans did that before they destroyed it. And it's also something that, but it could be something that happens in the future if there's another temple that's rebuilt before the world ends. And that's a whole other theological thing about whether people think there will be another temple. But then notice the instructions that Jesus gives them. How are they supposed to respond when they see this sign happen? They're supposed to flee. Those who live in Judea are supposed to flee, and they're supposed to flee quickly. Now, the thing that puzzles me here, if this is the end of the world, is why it's specific to Judea and why people are supposed to run away. Because my perspective on the end times has never been that it's just a local event. It's a worldwide event. So there doesn't seem to be anywhere that you can run from it. Now, if this is about the Romans destroying Jerusalem, that is something that's specific to the people of Judea, and they would need to run from it. And running from it would make a difference. If you get out of town before the Romans are actually at the gates of the city, that could make a difference in whether you live or not. Now, he does say that there will be great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, which does seem to be that this will mean that this will be the worst thing ever. This will be the big battle. Then it says never to be equaled again, which would seem to indicate that there will be more battles after this one. Because if this was the end of time, of course there wouldn't be another one to equal it afterward. So it's still, to me, as I'm going through this, I was wondering if I would kind of come to one conclusion or another. And I still lean towards saying that this is about the destruction of the temple. There will be some other challenges we'll run into in a second. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Okay, so all of this, again, to me, sounds like he's giving instructions that he expects will be relevant to the lives of the people he's talking to. He's giving his disciples instructions about something that will happen in the future. That's what it feels like. But then you have this comment, as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, if you're imagining again that the coming of the Son of Man is Jesus coming down on the clouds, then that makes perfect sense. He's saying that you're not going to miss it when Jesus returns, which I would certainly agree with. I certainly hope that Jesus returning is a big enough deal that people won't just miss it. But if the coming of the Son of Man means going up into heaven, it means his authority being vindicated, then how, I guess the question here is, how could the events in AD 70 be connected with the coming of the Son of Man if it's him coming to heaven and he's already ascended? And the best answer I could give to that, as far as my reading goes, the thinking would be that this destruction of the Jerusalem is further proof that Jesus was right. So those who did not actually witness the resurrection, they may not have proof right in front of their eyes that this guy that they had executed in the 30s was actually the Messiah. But when the destruction comes exactly like he promised it, that proves that he has come to heaven, that he has come to his authority, that he is in charge. When the consequences he threatened come out, that proves that he was right. Now, here's the other interesting thing, though. In verse 28, it says, wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So verse 27 says, whatever happens, you're not going to miss it. It's going to be a big deal. And how will you know? What will be the sign? Well, the vultures will gather wherever there's a carcass. Wherever there's a dead body, you'll see vultures. The interesting thing is that the word vulture here can also mean eagle. And every Roman legion carried a standard with an eagle on it. It was a symbol of Roman military might. And so you could also see this as, how are we going to know that this is the time? Well, it's going to be when the Roman armies surround Jerusalem. Because when Jerusalem is doomed and dead, you'll see the eagles surround it. So that could, again, be another connection with something happening in AD 70. All right, verse 29. Now here's one of those that really makes people feel like it's clearly talking about the end of the world. Immediately after the stress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, depending on which version you're using, those lines may or may not be offset as poetry the way you see them there. The reason the NIV has done that is because that's a quote taken from Isaiah. Now, if you read it in the context of Matthew, and with the assumption that all these other references are to Jesus returning at the end of time, then that clearly seems like things that would happen in the apocalypse. You know, the sun has not darkened, the moon has not, the sun, moon, and stars have not all darkened at the same time. You know, all these cosmic things, and we don't know of any, we don't have record of any kind of signs happening in the sky when Jerusalem was destroyed. But if there's one thing that I hope you'll pick up from the sermon series we've been doing and from the lessons we've been talking about, is that when you see Old Testament quotes, you need to trace them back. And this can be very instructive for helping us understand how the Old Testament uses imagery. This passage comes from Isaiah 13. So let's take a look. Isaiah 13:10. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. We jump down to 13. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger. That sure sounds like cosmic destruction. That sounds like the world is coming to an end. However, one of the things that often happens when we pull apocalyptic language from Isaiah and Ezekiel, and this will happen and like when we talk about Satan, things like that. First of all, let's look at the top of the chapter. A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. So what he's saying, what he's talking about is a prophecy against Babylon, which, hasn't existed since before the New Testament, right? Babylon is just gone. And then if we go down here, let's look at some more of the language from this prophecy. See, I will stir up against them the Medes, another people that don't exist anymore, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. So what is this prophecy about? This prophecy is about the destruction of Babylon, a historical event that happened 2,500 years ago. The sun didn't actually fall from the sky. The moon didn't go dark. The stars didn't. Why would he describe it that way? Well, there's two possible reasons. Number one is he's describing the emotional reality that if you live under the Babylonian Empire and the empire gets destroyed, it feels like the sky is falling. That's just how it feels. And that there does seem to have that cosmic significance. The other possibility is that the heavenly bodies are heavily associated with angels and heavenly beings, spiritual creatures. And in the Old Testament, there is this sense, we've talked about this in previous deleted scenes, that there are spiritual authorities that are put in charge of the nations. And so this cosmic language could also be referring to the spiritual counterpart of this battle, that the human beings are being defeated, but the spiritual beings, who represented as the sun, moon, and stars, are also being defeated, and God is also exerting power over them. It could be either way, but the thing that we conclude from here is that we know the sky didn't fall when Babylon was destroyed 2,500 years ago. And so we don't need to assume that when Jesus quotes it here, he means the same thing. In fact, we should more likely assume that he means the same thing that Isaiah meant. But then we get this passage here. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth, from one end of the heavens to the others. Full confession, this is the passage I struggle with. This is the one where I'm just not sure how to explain that other than the end of the world. To the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all peoples of the earth will mourn when they see him coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now remember, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, the clouds are how he gets up to heaven, not how he comes down. But still, I'm not sure what the sign of the Son of Man is, or how we would interpret that as something that happened in AD 70, other than simply the vindication of Jesus, because he said that the temple would be destroyed. He prophesied that this would happen, and it did. I'm not sure. I struggle with that one. So I guess that's a point for the apocalypse. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know the summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That's a pretty strong assertion that these events will be fulfilled during the lifetime of the people that Jesus is talking to. And that includes the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That there will be a lot of people still alive then who were alive when Jesus was talking. And so that would fulfill the claim Jesus is making here. And I really feel like you have to make you have to do some pretty big gymnastics to make an apocalyptic reading of this passage work for that. As we go through the rest of the passage, the only other parts that we see that lean towards one way or the other is the references to this coming of the Son of Man. And that really comes down to how you interpret what the coming of the Son of Man means. Is he coming down to earth, or is he coming up to heaven? Now, why do we get into all of this? Is this a salvation issue? Is this something super important? It's not a salvation issue. People can disagree on this chapter just like they can disagree on Revelation and still worship together and be earnest, believing Christians. I do think that it's important for us to recognize, number one, that it is possible to consistently and earnestly interpret these passages in both ways, because there are some who build really big theological systems on passages like this, and they will stake their theology, stake their reading of the Bible on this kind of stuff. And I would just want to caution that there's more than one way to read this. And one thing that it may be talking, this past chapter may be talking about the end of the world. It is definitely talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. There is no way around it that it is talking, at least in large part, about the destruction of Jerusalem. It also determines how you read this passage and the tone that it leaves on Jesus' message, which is, this is talking, the way this is very often used is to say everybody needs to be ready for Jesus to return at any moment. He could appear in the sky and rapture people, and that could have any moment. Oh, but I didn't mention that, by the way. That comes from this passage here, where it says, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. And some people will read that to mean there's a rupture where some people will disappear and some people won't. It could just as easily refer to a war in which some people die and some people don't, and there really isn't any rhyme or reason to who survives and who doesn't. The point is that these passages, Jesus seems to be telling them that he will be vindicated, that his judgment will be vindicated, and that even though it won't seem like it for a while, they're going to see signs and eventually see the proof that what Jesus declared was true. And this signal that the destruction of the temple is really seen as the final judgment that Jesus was right, because not only has the church been started, but the sacrificial system in the temple has been destroyed, and that path is no longer open to anyone. I don't know if this is helpful or confusing, but again, I hope that it shows that believing Christians can disagree on these kinds of passages. If you have any questions, or if you want to argue my interpretation or what I've been reading from this, feel free, leave a comment, message the church on Facebook, come by and visit, make an appointment to sit down and have coffee. We would love to have you at church on Sunday. We're doing our Palm Sunday sermon, and that's really going to be drawing together the themes of the conversation we've been having about the kingdom of God all into one place. I'm really excited about this coming sermon. This is the sermon that everything has been leading towards, is actually this Sunday. The day and the moment that everything is leading towards, of course, is the following Sunday at Easter. And in between, we have a Maundy Thursday service where we're going to reenact the story of the Last Supper. And we're going to have a Good Friday service where we will we'll read through the crucifixion of Jesus with candles and this symbolic set of candles. And then Saturday morning, we have an Easter egg hunt, and we'd love to have you visit us for any of those things. You can find more information about it on our Facebook page. I hope to see you at church. Otherwise, we'll see you back here on Deleted Scenes very soon. Thanks so much for listening.